Welcome to Virteva's Let's Talk podcast, the show that analyzes the newest technologies in cloud and how to manage the use of those technologies to help your business teams be successful. My name is Scott Ledwan, and today we're once again joined by Chris Strong, Microsoft Practice Lead at Virteva. And on today's episode, we'll be diving in and speculating around the exciting new announcements that came earlier this month on SharePoint, OneDrive, List, Stream, and more. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here.
So yeah, it's been a couple of weeks since the last time that we met and kind of talked about some of the goings on in the Microsoft world. I've since gone to the Caribbean, gotten a tan, had a nice time on vacation. While I was away, they actually announced all this cool stuff around SharePoint, OneDrive, List, all kind of the new innovations that are coming by. And right around that same period of two, no big surprises, Google was out announcing a whole bunch of stuff around kind of the Duet AI announcements. And if you happen to watch, I didn't actually have time to watch it live, but I ended up watching kind of one of the Verge's this podcast in 10 minutes or something like that, or this video in 10 minutes. And I feel like that they said the word AI at least 100 times in a 30-minute segment window. And then I watched an even more condensed version of that where it was just Sundar basically saying AI, 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 AI over and over and over again. Pretty funny stuff, but I mean, I feel like we're in the AI arms race at this point between Microsoft and Google, and they're trying to see who's going to be able to do it best and who's going to be able to do it fastest and make the most money off of it early on. I think it'll be also really interesting to see over the next few months, especially with the election cycle coming up, what it's going to look like in terms of, there's a lot of other countries out there that are regulating on this right now and trying to slow this down. And the US is not really doing much anything. But with the election season coming up, I wonder how many candidates we're going to see try to make this one of their platforms. Typically we see healthcare and the economy be big things, but I think this time around we may see technology and AI become a bigger kind of talking point.
Oh, undoubtedly, it'll be a key area of focus, and certainly something I think all the candidates will have something to say about various levels of governance related to it and policy and that sort of thing. And to the point about Google too, yeah, it is kind of the new state of things. It's the new topic du jour, and so it won't just be Google. Build is having their keynote this week, and I have no doubt there'll be a similar hot cut that just repeats the AI term constantly. So it's just the new normal for all of us in this space, I think, for the time being, at least until the next big shiny topic comes along. Although even then, the way things are moving, AI will have something to do with that inevitably anyway. So yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure. But kind of focusing back in on the topic of this podcast. So at the beginning of the month, Microsoft had their M365 conference in Vegas. Neither you or I had the opportunity to attend, me because of vacation, and you just had some other commitments. But there was a lot more announcements that came out of it, I feel like, this year than they have in previous years. And the big announcements were mainly aimed around SharePoint, OneDrive, and some of the other collaboration tools that tie more directly into that. So the SharePoint announcements are essentially aimed around, again, adding AI into it, finding ways that you don't have to be a SharePoint developer to do a lot of the stuff in there anymore. Microsoft, they announced probably about 7 to 10 years ago that they were modernizing SharePoint, and this is the modernizing of modern SharePoint. So it's the new modern SharePoint, which is a mouthful to say, but that's essentially what we're seeing. They're again kind of getting back to the conversation around all the thrilling announcements across the various platforms. The 365 Copilot for Loop app also launched into preview recently. We've got the new Teams out there. Copilot was just announced and being added into Viva. We talked about Security Copilot a few weeks back. The momentum is really building on all of the AI kind of arms race stuff with the ChatGPT 4. SharePoint was just the next logical thing, and builds going on this week. So I expect that we'll hear probably even more over this week about how some of those new tools in the AI chest are actually going to play into the development of SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. So I have kind
Yeah.
of 4 or 5 different topics broken out for this podcast. We'll try and keep it around 20 to 30 minutes so we don't bore our listeners. But I wanted to dig in a little bit more on Copilot for SharePoint, the new OneDrive, because they just keep redesigning and adding new layers to OneDrive. And I was reading about some of the changes in Message Center today, and they're good changes. It kind of gets back to the Microsoft Delve conversation of like, who do I know who I'm sharing with? And they had to add in all these different layers of, hey, this is why this file is available to this person. We're starting to see more of that showing up in OneDrive now in the middle of May. More stream enhancements are coming with SharePoint. So classic streams retiring. They're adding in not only more power to stream, but they're enhancing on the migration tool. And we're also seeing the ability to add kind of almost like carousel videos into SharePoint pages. So that page feels a little bit more kind of dynamic than it has in the past. And then kind of the last couple areas is just updates around Microsoft lists. I'm not a huge list user myself, but I see a lot of value in it for the folks that do use it. And
Hmm.
then just from a general content administration and security enhancement standpoint, we'll talk a little bit more about some of that stuff that's coming to OneDrive and SharePoint and how that kind of ties in not only to the Purview suite, but also into the AI improvements. So let's talk about Copilot in SharePoint. So as always, again, it's great to have you here, Chris. We'll start the conversation talking about Copilot and SharePoint. Um, Tell our listeners a little bit about what you kind of took away from the recent blog post and some of the recent announcements that came out of Vegas.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone didn't expect it to go in this direction to some degree. It's pretty clear at this point that Microsoft's intention is to bring Copilot, in essence, that AI Copilot functionality, at least, to the entirety of the stack at some level. So I don't think there's going to be very many of certainly the Microsoft 365 tools, including all the security tools, as we've seen in past announcements, and inevitably, I'm sure in a lot of Azure and many, Dynamics certainly, and all these other elements of Microsoft technology stack. Just about everything's going to have Copilot integrated into it to some level. And so obviously it wasn't surprising to see it also come to SharePoint and OneDrive. I think the unique quality that it's bringing and what they're trying to do with it in the SharePoint context is furthering that, I don't know if democratization is the right word, but that citizen development aspect to SharePoint, where you don't necessarily need a heavy duty developer just to do even rudimentary components of an intranet design or site collection, provisioning, and the ability to just have some meaningful stuff built there, and not have to put a lot of manual effort or have advanced knowledge. And I think so far, at least from what they showed, it seems like it's going to be effective in that way. Inevitably, it'll also evolve quite a bit over the months and years to come. But yeah, I think it's going to help, especially for those companies that want to be able to assign each department, for example. It's one of the more common things that we've seen is, okay, the HR site collection, you know what, HR, you're going to have somebody that's responsible for keeping that up to date and maintaining it and structuring it how you want. Obviously, you want to stay within corporate guidelines, and they've kind of got a piece of that in the announcement as well, with some of the design or SharePoint designer functions where you can have company logos and brands and colors and all that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing standardized. And so, yeah, with AI, it just makes it that much more accessible for the company to, I think, push it down to other parts of the business to say, okay, we think you can meaningfully handle maintaining this for yourselves and building out new functionality without needing to go to days or months of SharePoint designer training or SharePoint administration training and all that, or have to put it all on IT shoulders, or have us always have to go out and hire heavy duty consultants to do this work for everything. And I don't think, just to qualify that, I don't think it eliminates the need for outside help or expert help, let's call it, whether inside or outside, for various aspects of intranet design and other parts of the more comprehensive aspects of SharePoint, certainly when it comes to things like customization and applications and building advanced list structures and that sort of thing. And web parts, of course, yes, that's still going to have a role to play for really smart SharePoint developers. But for a lot of the more, let's call it, foundational parts of SharePoint, I do think this is likely to have a meaningful impact. So it'll be interesting to see once they actually roll it out, what some of the licensing structure looks like around it and the cost as a result, and then just how accessible it becomes. I think they're going to have an interesting road ahead to see how they can do it such that it doesn't lead people down the wrong paths, because AI will inevitably, I'm sure, give good and bad recommendations as it tries to decipher what that user is telling it or asking it. And so how can it make sure that it doesn't create sort of volatility in a bad way when it comes to that type of enhancement that they're bringing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's certainly going to be meaningful, I think, for most organizations that use SharePoint.
Yeah, and for our audio only listeners, it's probably kind of hard to visualize what all this looks like because it's just AI in SharePoint. But for our YouTube and our video podcast, we'll put some additional stuff up here on the screen so you can kind of take a peek at it. But essentially, what this does is, if you've seen the Copilot in Word and PowerPoint, where you click the Copilot button and then it pops out a little text prompt to chat, is it's going to do the same thing in SharePoint. You're going to say, hey, design me a page for human resources, and I want it to have this information and incorporate this document onto it. And you'll do that in that little Copilot text box, and it'll just zip you up a page real quick. It'll be basic. It'll have some built-in web parts. It'll kind of design it. You'll be able to go in and apply your own branding to it. So your company colors, images, maybe you have some kind of like stock assets that you want to bring into the page. It'll do all that for you, but once it builds that out, yes, you can go back and you can interact with the Copilot AI, or you can kind of just dive in and start configuring the pages from there. So there's definitely still going to be a component that someone actually has to do some work here. It's not just going to generate you something out of the box that it's going to work perfectly for you. It's going to give you a template, unless the template's good enough for you, which in most cases, though, I believe that it probably won't be. Where we kind of see the conversation going from a SharePoint development standpoint is Copilot is going to be able to build you the basics, but it's probably not going to be able to do the advanced workflows in the things that you rely on a SharePoint designer today for. As they start to talk a little bit more kind of about where the files live in the infrastructure, we'll probably hear more about how Copilot may be able to help manage that kind of stuff, but they haven't really dug in too much on that stuff, although they could be talking about that at Build right now. So if you have files that have been out there for years and years and they're not being touched, Copilot may be smart enough to start, again, we're speculating here, may be able to start looking at, hey, these files are old, no one's touching them. I'm going to remove the permissions from them, just to make sure that we're trying to be as safe as possible here and make sure that none of your data is overexposed. And then from there, if I don't see permissions get added back onto the file within like the next 6 months, a year, is I'm just going to delete that. And I'm sure that we saw this kind of with during the pandemic period, where there was a lot of people working hybrid, and there was a lot of people recording every single meeting that they were in. A lot of those meetings never got touched again, and they just kind of sat there and they continued to eat up space on Microsoft's infrastructure. And then we saw the new rule come out that, hey, meetings have an auto expiration period of 180 days. So if you don't touch it, or it doesn't get saved, or you don't extend the expiration period, is just going to go away. So these are the kind of things where AI's already been behind the scenes kind of doing some of that stuff, but I'm sure it's not too much of a stretch to say that we'll probably start to see some of that same stuff apply itself to SharePoint and OneDrive in that context as well.
For sure.
So let's dive into OneDrive next. The refreshed OneDrive experience is designed to provide users with a fast and seamless way to access their files from anywhere, while also ensuring world-class security and compliance. It offers a comprehensive file experience across all of Microsoft 365, enabling users to quickly find and access their content, and ultimately really enhancing on their productivity. So that's a mouthful there, and it sounds like a lot of marketing speech, but the Copilot kind of approach, and the AI approach, really more AI than Copilot in this case, is to just make it easier to find your stuff, understand who has access to what, and give you ways to kind of color code, label, tag, so you know what you're looking for, where it's going to be, and kind of provide that to you up front so that you don't have to dig through 3 or 4 or 5 different folders to ultimately find out what you're looking for. So, Chris, you care to dig in a little bit more on that and kind of talk about what you saw in the announcement?
Yeah, most of what I gleaned from it was that it's primarily just quality of life improvements in the OneDrive context. I mean, it's there's only so many different ways to polish a file storage and sharing application or a repository or service like that. But I think there was some meaningful stuff. Certainly the color coding, while seemingly superficial, does have merit, and it is something that's handy in those situations where it can make a big difference to have that at a glance sort of color coding system that some people find works well for them, to help catalog and categorize things a little bit more effectively, or at least add a new dimension to that. So I think that's helpful. It's unfortunate it took this long to come about, but it's nice to have it finally now. And then yeah, the broader aspect of discoverability, that's a common challenge that we encounter a lot when we're working with organizations, is the users, especially over time when they've used OneDrive and by virtue of that Teams and SharePoint and all those other pieces for an extended period, it does become sort of common to lose track of where something got stored one time along the way, or some folder that was created, and all the hierarchical nature of the folders and all that, or somebody sent me an email with a file attachment. I can't remember if I put it in my Teams or OneDrive or whatever. And so some of what they're trying to do to bring what really was kind of already being done to some degree by Delve, although was just kind of rarely used in our
Yeah,
experience,
they've
or
almost
people didn't
taken
really
Delve
have
and
a lot
kind
of
of
experience.
relabeled it as to just Office Insights now, and now it lives on
Yeah,
portal.office.com. Or what's what's
right,
what's
exactly.
the
And so
what's the new
now
URL going to be? It's something like cloud.office.com or something like that.
Microsoft, cloud out Microsoft, baby. Yep.
Yeah, get ready to
um,
retrain your users on how to get to all their sites coming later this year.
yep. But yeah, I mean, it brings that delvification aspect, that file discoverability in a little bit more sophisticated way, just more to the surface in the interfaces that users were already defaulting to anyway, like their OneDrive repository. And then of course, yeah, the what at least for the time being is portal.office.com, but eventually will be cloud.microsoft. And so yeah, it was a good change. It's also going to allow Copilot in the OneDrive context to be more front and center, so that one of the other pieces that I think flew under the radar a little bit that was more of a SharePoint focused announcement was semantic indexing. And the analogy Microsoft used was, when the human brain hears something like elephant as a word, they're not just thinking of elephant in the way a computer would traditionally, which is like, yeah, here's the data on an elephant. It would, in a human way, you'd think about, okay, elephants are typically gray in color. They live in, natively places like Africa and Asia. They have big ears or small ears, depending on the breed. They eat plants, et cetera, et cetera. So we're thinking about all these corollary aspects or attributes associated with an object or an item. And so semantic indexing tries to, through AI, essentially replicate that way of interacting. Well, not even interacting with, that's not the right word, but uh, categorizing detail about a search
Mhm.
query. So instead of just looking at keywords in a search query, semantic indexing says, no, let's look at the downstream attributes that we can use that graph API that's collecting all the telemetry in that tenant to decipher maybe what the user is actually looking for, even if their keywords don't explicitly match that file name that it ultimately has, or the individual that shared it, or whether it's being shared at all, or all these other pieces of the puzzle that sometimes go into what a user actually is trying to figure out, that now can exist right there in OneDrive or SharePoint in the search parameters, or Teams for that matter, or the portal.office.com
Yeah.
experience. And so that probably will have a more profound effect long term, even though it's not the more obvious new feature set that they announced around it. But yeah, it's a lot of quality of life stuff overall in the OneDrive
Yeah, and
sense.
just to clarify on that too, when you're talking about semantic index and semantic searches, it's the LLM, the large language model, is only looking at your graph data. It's not looking at anything out on
Sure.
the
Yeah.
internet. And from what I've seen through blog articles and through some YouTube videos that I've seen on the Mechanics channel, is that once that search completes, it dumps the search. So it's not actually storing that and indexing that across, because eventually that will become a garbage in, garbage out problem, as it would keep looking at all these different searches and you would never actually find what you were looking for. We covered a little bit at the top of the show too, but I just wanted to again kind of re-highlight on the improved kind of like sharing and link experience in OneDrive and SharePoint. And this is probably going to be of biggest benefit to most just regular everyday end users is they've made it easier to kind of hit that share button and just drop email addresses in, drop a message in, show you who you're sharing it with, and either copy and send that link. Before, it was kind of like this 3 radial dot menu where you had to say, I want to share with everyone, or I want to share with just these people or just my organization. They're making that a lot easier. Honestly, like that was confusing for me, and I consider myself an intermediate to an advanced level technologist on this stuff. But I'm glad to see that they're doing that. And one of the other things that they're doing too is they're giving you a little bit more. So when you go in today and you have a file and you click manage access, they're making it a little bit easier to see who has access to those files. And that's something else that they're incorporating through portal.office.com and cloud.microsoft.com, and just like the delve experience of understanding who has access to a file, why do they have access to a file, and they're giving you the ability to very easily take access to the file away if they shouldn't have it anymore. So that's another one of those kind of like those streamlined file sharing experience things that they're taking care of. That's been long asked for, but they're probably in previous versions of iterations of OneDrive and SharePoint, there wasn't the easiest way to surface that. And now is there, I don't want to say like, it feels like this new version of OneDrive is they're just splashing a new coat of paint on it, because a lot of the features that are being touted right now that are new have actually been being added over the last several months. Honestly, all the way back to last summer, I've been seeing some of this stuff come in, but now they're putting that new kind of like coat of paint and polish on it to show, hey, there's new buttons and new interactions and new dialogue here. Here's how you take advantage of it. I'm sure that over the next couple of months, you'll probably also see those tutorials start to pop back up. Even though you've been using OneDrive for months, it'll say, hey, there's a new experience, and that'll kind of help you help your organization out with kind of adopting the new technology without having to spend too many resources into retraining and setting out communications on it. Microsoft's going to do some of that for you. All right. So 2 topics down, 2 to go. Before we jump over to talking about Stream, let's take a quick break, and then we will jump back in.
Searching for an IT consulting partner that provides 24/7 end-user support, Microsoft Cloud Solutions, security tools, and network management? Get to know Virteva. Our high-touch, white-glove customer experience helps businesses like yours that want next-generation technology under a managed services model. Get predictable and consistent IT support at a predictable cost. With an expert team of professionals and a strong commitment to customer satisfaction, Virteva is well equipped to take your business to the next level in today's rapidly changing digital landscape. Learn more at Virteva.com.
All right, and we're back. So there's been a lot going on with Stream over the past several months. If you've been under a rock, Stream Classic is getting retired. Basically, it started retiring already in February of this year, 2023. And by the time we're into February of 2024, Stream will be fully retired, and the replacement, which is Stream on SharePoint, which has already been around for some time now, will become the new mainstay for Stream. So over the past several months to a couple of years, Stream has undergone some significant improvements and changes to make video content more visible and usable for users. So you've got the web app out there, which is pluggable right into SharePoint. But they've been adding features on top of that, including transcripts, captions, auto chapters, which is honestly my favorite part about it right now, because especially with the amount of workshop work that we do at Virteva, is I'd no longer have to go out there and manually set all the chapter times for our clients. Enhanced sharing options, background noise suppression, even after the video's already been recorded. That's super cool. Variable playback speeds, which is something that arguably probably should have been there at the very beginning. And then additional analytics behind the scenes. So you can see who's playing the videos, at what time they're playing them, what are the most replayed areas of the videos. I'm sure things will come. But overall, all these enhancements aim to provide a better video experience and reduce the amount of time that it takes to bring video content either to market or just to your organization. So just kind of continuing on the Stream piece, as it seems like Microsoft is continuing to focus on enhancing overall video playback and management experience in that tool. Chris, are there any specific updates related to the integration of Stream on SharePoint or with SharePoint pages and maybe even Viva Connection sites that you thought were particularly worth sharing with the audience?
Yeah, I think it's just nice to be able to now govern and manage stream videos in the same context as SharePoint, instead of this being a kind of this extra separate area that you had to also administrate and deal with all the different governance aspects of stream in a separate way. Now, by virtue of it being built on SharePoint, it's less overhead for IT and security teams, and it's a little bit more natively integrated this way into how stream is often being leveraged to begin with, and in the sense that SharePoint sites and embedding it there. Also, Viva, well, what currently is Yammer, are kind of on its way to transitioning to Viva Engage. That's often a very logical place for stream videos to end up as well. And so it's been nice to see them just finish up that transition to make it no longer really a hesitation point on the timing to switch from Stream Classic to Modern Stream. And so, yeah, it's nice quality of life things, kind of like with OneDrive. They updated some key things with regards to playlists, the transcription and noise suppression aspect, and the variable speed playback, as you mentioned, Scott. Like, all those are handy things just to make stream that much more practical and livable for organizations, so that they're not forced to look outside of Microsoft 365 or things like Vimeo or YouTube or anything else, just to have a meaningfully functional video hosting platform. So it's good. I think it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do with Copilot in the context of stream. Obviously, with SharePoint's Copilot, I'm sure there'll be some touch points just sort of through that mechanism anyway. But I fully expect, just like we've seen with everything else, Copilot down the road will have some direct applicability to stream.
Yeah.
I could see, for example, real-time translation, maybe as the video has like speech occurring, that it can real-time translate it to another language and match the inflection and all that stuff. I could see things like that coming eventually. But at least through some of these foundational things that they're doing to effectively finish that transition to SharePoint for stream and have that modern stream framework in place, at least unlocks that potential. So yeah, and the playlist. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say you create your team's avatar and then you tell Copilot, host the meeting for you and just have it like mouth around and do dabs and salutes.
Yeah, and for the playlist too, it sounds somewhat minor, but there's been plenty of scenarios in how stream has often been applied for things like training videos, new employee onboarding videos, that type of thing, where that playlist function is super handy. And I think a lot of orgs would find it useful, even though it's a pretty rudimentary thing, just for what it represents, and that ability to say, look, here, go to this link or go to this SharePoint site or this Yammer page, and it will sequence the videos that we want you to watch in the order we want you to watch them. And that is practical value.
Yep, for sure. All right, so we won't spend too much time on Microsoft Lists, but Microsoft is adding a little bit more flexibility and customization options when it comes to information collection. Were there any other notable enhancements worth mentioning around lists?
I think just the performance improvements will be helpful. Especially, I've seen a lot of lists developed by not only our team, but about different organizations where there's some more multimedia aspects to them, where they're using it as sometimes a way to do things like asset management or tracking, or for registering to order different things, and having heavy image files associated with these lists and that sort of thing. So the performance enhancements should make it that much more usable and more efficient for use. That some of the filters and item groupings and simplified creation and switching of views, all, again, quality of life improvements that were badly needed and should make lists a little bit more approachable as a practical or foundational way to do list. A list is a list is a list, but in a more meaningful and practical way, have it applied to business operations scenarios and different project scenarios and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned project, because project is one of the areas where they are starting to do more list integration on, and that shouldn't be too surprising. They haven't outright said anything yet about kind of canning the legacy version of project out there that is like the desktop client version, which is for the really heavy power user project managers, but they are seemingly starting to do more integration with project and planner and lists. So I wouldn't say that we're too far off from seeing a new version of project where it becomes more online only, but we're not quite there yet. But all the tools like lists and planner and to do, those are kind of things that came out of the project management piece of Microsoft Project into their own kind of separate apps to kind of be like those smaller, more lightweight apps that onboarded you more into that experience. And what we're seeing now with like Project for Web is that they're starting to add more and more features into that to make it more of a wholesale kind of like solution for or replacement for that traditional desktop client of Project. But not quite there yet. 2025, 2027, I bet you we're looking at a whole new kind of like either tiered plan of Project or we're seeing an eventual retirement of that tool. But again, that's all speculative. So project managers don't at me. All right, so let's close things out talking about the announcements around kind of like oversharing policies, cross-tenant content migration. We can start with oversharing and kind of content administration. Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about the challenges that organizations face today when it comes to oversharing content in terms of SharePoint and OneDrive?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a top mind concern is how the employees throughout the organization are being good stewards of sharing out different data, different sites, different access to various things. Teams is certainly among the concerning items there. And, there's always been certain levels of control and governance that can be applied, and we see various levels of that being done across companies. And we try to encourage every company to certainly follow zero trust principles and make sure that people can't do things, whether inadvertently or deliberately, that are not by design or not intentional or not conducive to the effective sharing of data and secure sharing of data and all that. So yeah, with the data access governance insights, it's certainly going to expose a little bit more readily some of the visibility to the especially IT and security teams about what's being shared, to whom, by whom, for how long, all those various things that are necessary to maintain governance and visibility over that. And so it'll be good to start to try and get more organizations to leverage that type of thing. I mean, when Defender for Cloud Apps has been involved, that's also been helpful to mitigate some of that risk. But now just having that much more of a native function within SharePoint to surface those types of attributes and maybe even alert on them more readily is always going to be a helpful side effect.
I think that that's the hard part of being a SharePoint administrator too, is like you're spinning up the sites, you're giving people access, you're managing the environment, but you don't know what people should or should not have access to. And that's not necessarily the job of the SharePoint administrator. So adding in those governance insights and being able to kind of produce reports and get the people maybe on your security team or your HR or your compliance teams a little bit more involved with that is going to take some of that burden of people kind of pointing fingers and saying, hey, why do these people have access to these sites, off the burden or off the shoulder of the SharePoint administrator, and moved more in the direction of where those responsibilities should actually lie. That wraps up our last segment on the latest advancements in SharePoint administration and security. There's a lot more to come here, as we've talked about on some of our previous podcasts, and just as we talk with customers and they ask us, when is all this Copilot stuff coming? It's only available to 20 private preview customers right now. They did recently announce that they are opening up a kind of like I don't know if you want to call it a beta, but it is a paid beta where you are going to have to pay to get in. Microsoft has not really said what the price of that is going to be yet, nor have they said when they are actually planning on starting that for an additional 500 companies. But as we learn more, we'll certainly talk about it on the podcast here. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us at letstalk@virteva.com. We'll be happy to answer that stuff for you and work with you and your organization on any of your Copilot or AI needs. For more information around SharePoint and the recent OneDrive announcements, you can visit the Microsoft 365 blog, where they recently made their official announcement. If there are any additional questions or you need help implementing these features or others, feel free to contact us at virteva.com, www.virteva.com. And that being said, Chris, anything else that you're excited about that's coming outside of Build over the next couple of months?
Oh, no, just eager to see more of how they're going to infuse Copilot into everything, like we were mentioning at the top. And especially also how some of the security pieces are going to formulate around Copilot. I mean, we've seen some of the security Copilot notifications and announcements already, but just as that nears full release, just exciting to see where all this goes into the fall.
Yep. And we know that Inspire is coming up in July too, so there will probably be even more Copilot information coming out as we hit kind of like early to mid-July, and we'll be sure to talk about that as we get closer to it. So again, thanks to our audio and video listeners out there for listening to another episode of the Let's Talk Virteva podcast. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.